Hey, everybody. What's up, Tori?
How's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
Doing good. I'm trying to log in on my phone. I have to drive to an appointment, so I'm figuring out how to do this mobile meeting. But yeah, things are great. Hello.
Good to hear. Yeah, hopefully the phone doesn't blow up when you try to join on mobile. Nice to meet you, who I've never met before. Welcome. We're going to start probably in, I don't know, 8 minutes.
All right. Okay. That's fine. Yeah, I'll do a demo for you, okay? I'm just dropping it up there. Just...
Is it not starting yet?
The dude said he needs like extra 8 minutes for that. Do his business, whatever.
So welcome. My name is Morgan. You may or may not have met me before, but I have done this talk many times. I do it every so often when we start new projects in the online community I founded called Tech Fleet. So this is just another rendition. I'm recording this. If you have to leave at any point, no worries. I will send out the recording afterwards. And just a couple of ground rules. If you are listening to the presentation, I ask that you put yourself on mute. And feel free to write your questions in the notes in Bowel that everybody can see it. I can't see the notes and I can't see the comments, so I'm just going to come back at the end and like take questions, comments, everything like that. This should probably take about an hour, maybe a little bit more, but I'll try to go through it really quickly. And without further ado, I consider myself a UX architect, kind of like a full cycle UX designer and researcher. I also have a lot of background and experience in the product side of things, being able to orchestrate experiences end to end. And early in my UX career, got a lot of experience with Agile in the world of Agile. So I want to show you what Agile really is, kind of go over the difference between the two different methods, the method you're taught in school and the method of Agile. And then we'll talk about how Agile applies to UX, and then get into the Google Design Sprint, which is one of the many UX methods for Agile. So let's start with what's called waterfall. You may have heard that term before. If you haven't heard that term before, you might be aware of how I'm describing it. So we'll take, for instance, an example. Let's say that you've been hired to build a scooter and you have 18 months. So you have 18 months to do the whole thing, to design it, to research what you need, to put it all together to test it with people and then put it into production. And in those 18 months, you break it down into different phases. So for a couple months, you build all your requirements and you figure out exactly what needs to be done. And then for the next 3 months, you design all of it. And then for the next year, you develop all of it. And then after you're developing it, you test it with people. And then it's ready for launch to market. And everything happens in phases, meaning you can't move on to the second step without going into the first step and completing the first step. So there's no development happening in the test phase. There's no design happening in the development phase. So you go out and talk to users, and you have to make sure that you gather all of the requirements for everything that scooter ever is going to be up front. So of course, users want all the bells and whistles. They want a touchscreen, and they want a GPS, and they want to carry their cat around in the city and on the road and off the road. And they want to take their cat hiking. And you write it all down. This is everything that the requirements are ever going to be. And at the end of the production cycle for 18 months, this scooter is going to do a whole lot of things. So then you move on to the design phase, and you're designing everything that you've defined in the requirements phase. So you design the GPS, and you design the touchscreen, you design the cat chariot, you design it all. And then when you're done that, you take it into development, and the developers themselves are going to build this thing in pieces. So they're going to build the wheels first, and then they're going to build the body, and then they're going to build the motor. And that takes another 5 months. And then when they're all done, the parts, they'll put it all together, and then they'll test things. And none of the testing happens until it's all done. But at the end of it, you have a nice little cat chariot, and you can put a cat in it, and you can test it. And now it's 18 months later, and you hit the market. But the problem is your users' needs have changed. This user got a phone. They didn't need a GPS anymore, and their cat ran away. So they just decided to buy a bike about 8 months ago. And it turns out the rest of the market doesn't really need a scooter like that anymore. But you're stuck with that scooter. How much time and money did you waste building something that is never going to get used? You spent all the time in the world, and your client spent all the money in the world for 18 months building some fantastic thing that carries a cat around with a GPS that nobody's going to use. This is the reality of most of the products in the world that build on waterfall. Not to say that waterfall is not effective. Waterfall can be very effective, but this is the way that we're taught in school. We're taught to do our research before we do our design, to do our design before we do our testing, to do our testing before we do our development. What we're taught in the world is very different than what we're taught in school. What you're taught in school is called waterfall. If this sounds familiar, and you've been on a project before where you've done the design process in phases, maybe this rings a bell to you. And what happened at the end? How satisfied were your users? How closely did it meet the needs of people? What'd you do in the next project? Did you repeat the same thing? Maybe. Well, I'm here to tell you that there's a better way of working. It's not taught in most of the school programs. And that is the way of the industry. The way of the industry allows people to develop and deliver in way different ways than what the UX process is taught in school. No, I'm not saying that you always have control over this. You definitely don't always have control over this. There's certain times and scenarios Where you get into a company and they have to use waterfall, or they don't have to, but they want to. It's a separate conversation outside of this. But I'm going to imagine that this is the assumption that we're looking at the ability to adopt new ways of working. If you could try anything in the world on your team, you could try this way that I'm about to show you. So to recap, if any of this rings true, you're probably thinking about a waterfall thing. If you do your project in sequential phases, if you gather all of your requirements and all the research up front without going back, if you don't show anybody any progress until the end, if you mess up in a later phase, there's nothing you can do. If you learn something new, you're not going back and doing more research. You're not going back and adjusting the designs most of the time. You are not adjusting the requirements. You're moving forward in lieu of that. All of this describes waterfall, the phased approach of work. And now we're going to learn the complete opposite of that. Agile is more of a philosophy than anything. It's a standard of living, kind of a mindset that you put yourself in. There are processes and methods of Agile, and that's where you'll hear words like Scrum or Kanban. And those are specific ways of carrying out Agile. But Agile itself is more like a Zen state. It is a philosophy. It's actually not a prescribed way of working either. There is no one way to work Agile. Don't ever let anybody tell you that. Don't let them ever tell you that there is a way that's always the same, because it's not. And I'll go over why. But the philosophy of Agile, really at the end of the day, is a strategy that your team invokes on how and when you deliver customer value. To go back to the rules, in Agile, you don't perform sequential phases. You might be performing phases of work in parallel. So you might be doing research and design and development all at the same time. It's not to say that you will always do it, but it is not always a sequential phase of work. It's not to say that research will never block design, but there's also a possibility that the work will happen in parallel. You gather the most important requirements at any given time. In the beginning, you gather the most important things you need to figure out. In the middle, you gather the most important things that you have not figured out yet. At the end, you gather the most important things that you have not figured out yet. You deliver those to get feedback and validate the direction. And then you go back to the drawing board and you gather more requirements based on what's next. You're actually continuously delivering things. And you're not continuously delivering parts of the thing. You're continuously delivering something usable and testable to your clients and to your users throughout the entire process. And if things change, if nobody wants to cat chariot anymore, you have to change direction with that changing need. Agile builds that process right into the process by default. There was a bunch of nerds that went into a room one day back in 2001, and they decided to write the rules of Agile, called the Agile Manifesto. And it's literally just this. It's not a book. It's not a bunch of templates for Scrum and sprints. All it is these words. That's it. We are uncovering better ways of developing by doing it and helping others do it. Through the work, we have come to value 1, individuals and interactions over processes. What does that mean? I don't need to set a process for something. I just need to talk to people. 2, working software over comprehensive documentation. What does that mean? I don't need to document the hell out of it. I just need to make it work and give it to people. 3, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. What does that mean? I don't need to figure everything out up front. I can figure things out with customers as I go. 4, responding to change over following a plan. They also caveated. They say that is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So it's not to say that they don't ever have processes, that they don't ever have contracts, that they don't ever follow a plan. They do, but they're also ready to value the things on the left way quicker. And that's it. That's how Agile rules were written. That's it. You can go to this website today and see it. This is some of the philosophies that you may see carried out in Agile. Progress over process. Deliver value early and often. Build fast, fail fast. Learn fast, adjust fast. Let the team experiment with new ways of work. You don't need all the requirements up front. Do whatever makes sense in the context of the team. Share your progress. Pivot. Now, these are not my hard and fast rules. They aren't the Bible. They're not the 10 Commandments. They're just my rules that I really hold true in Agile. The first one is build fast, fail fast, learn fast, adjust fast. If you're doing waterfall, you're doing all the work and then showing all the way at the end. You're not building fast and failing fast. Failing fast means you show it to people and validate the direction, and then you go back to the drawing board when you need to. And if you need to change the direction, you adjust immediately, very quickly. You don't need to talk about something forever. You don't need to make it perfect. You don't need to have a plan in place that's perfect. You just need to start doing and delivering and failing fast. Hugely important mindset in Agile. Do what makes sense in the context of your team. You could get training all day in what Scrum is and what Kanban is. But when you get onto a team and you start working with an Agile team, you will be breaking the rules that you were taught. And Agile is meant to fit and mold every single team differently. The team that's forming, working full-time is going to be operating very differently than the team that's forming and working 5 hours a week. You have to bend the rules of Agile to fit the context of who you're working with and what your team structure is. And it kind of goes without saying, but in order for you to build fast successfully, you kind of have to only work on the single most important thing at a time, or the top 3 most important things at a time. Because if you're failing fast and you're delivering really low priorities, you're delivering a lot, but are you delivering the most value? No. You're delivering something that is very low value. You're doing it often, but the most effective way that you can build fast is by building the most important thing and validating the most important thing so that you can figure out how to adjust your plans. And going along those lines, always deliver something that can be tested and used after you deliver it. Every single time you deliver it. Could be every couple weeks, every week. Every time you deliver something, it should always be some complete usable functionality that you can then validate. And the way you do it in Agile is you determine what at each step is the minimum viable product. It's called the MVP. and it's a concept. It's an acronym. It's also a concept that means many things. But what it essentially composes of is something that's simple, valuable, actionable, and testable. And the Agile process is just a repeated cycle. You figure out what you're going to do long term, which is your minimum marketable product. You have an idea of that. It's not concrete. You think you know where you're going. The second step from there is to break down what is the first attempt at what you are going to release and validate. What is the minimum viable product? Then you build and deliver the minimum viable product. And then when you deliver it, you test it. You get your feedback. You talk to your customers, talk to your users. You adjust your plans. And then after that, step 5 is basically just repeating steps 2 to 4. So you would create MVP 2, build it, deliver it, test it. And then you'll take that back to the drawing board and build MVP 3, build it, deliver it, test it. And then you'll build MVP 4, and MVP 5, and MVP 6, and as many MVPs as it takes forever and ever and ever and ever until you've hit the minimum marketable product. Sometimes you build 2 MVPs and you're done. Sometimes you build 17 MVPs and you're never done. Breaking down into the chunks of work, each time you deliver something is called an iteration. And that's a term in Agile. An iteration is, think of it as a chunk of work. And every time you do your chunk of work is also considered an MVP. It is a smaller minimum viable product of maybe one single piece of functionality. And your product MVP is 70 features that go into whatever you have defined as the MVP. But when you deliver one single chunk in a week, in 2 weeks, you are delivering a very small component of that larger MVP. Then you bring it into testing. And based on what you learn in testing, your feedback testing could be vague here. It could be meetings with people. It could be user testing. It could be lots of different things. You bring that back into the dev backlog, and it gets planned for another iteration. And then you just keep going, keep repeating. And each time you deliver something, you're only delivering what you've gathered requirements for the highest priority things. So taking back the example of the scooter, if I was building the MVP of the scooter, I would figure out what it must have. And sorry, Kat, I'm not going to drive you around for the MVP. You're not going to be driving around in a cat chariot for the MVP 1. What it must have is driving in the city, being able to drive at a reasonable speed. One person seating, not a person and a cat. And when I deliver that thing, MVP 1, I test it, I evaluate if I'm on the right track, put it into the backlog and build MVP 2. And then I build MVP 3. And then I build MVP 4. And eventually I get to the cat chariot. And the cat chariot is an example of what's called the minimum marketable product. And so maybe when I bring that thing to market, it's going to have a cat chariot. But the 4 products that I released before then are going to be smaller, still valuable, still usable, but smaller versions of that thing that are built up over time. And what you're actually doing from a delivery standpoint is you're delivering value to users incrementally. The first time you release it, they get a little bit of value. Second time you release it, they should have more. Third time, even more. By the time you build the minimum marketable product, they should be happy as hell. They should be real happy and provide a lot of value in that product that you validated 4 times over. And what happens when you do this with Agile? Let's take the build order of the scooter with the cat chariot. Well, I would build obviously something usable that I can have people drive around and give me feedback on every single time. And you'll notice that the timeline of this thing is still 18 months. But what I've delivered in 3 months is something usable. It's not the complete thing. It's not very valuable. It's a skateboard. And maybe only certain people can use the skateboard and give me feedback around it. That's okay. I can get some feedback, take it back to the drawing board, and then build MVP2, which is a scooter with a handle, but it's not a motorized scooter. And then I build the thing and I deliver it in 3 months from there. And then I get the thumbs up from users and I'm like, all right, great. I'm heading into MVP number 3. And then I build a motorized scooter. Still doesn't have a cat chariot on it. Doesn't have the bells and whistles, doesn't have the GPS, doesn't have the off-road capabilities, but it's got more value than the non-motorized scooter because it can go faster and it's more efficient. I can go further with it. It's providing more value to users. And then I build MVP4, which is the minimum marketable product. Now, what happens if the requirements change? 3 months in, we realize that we're not headed in the right direction. Well, you didn't really waste that much time or money. And you can pivot, change direction. Maybe your new direction is you're building a bike. And it could happen in any phase. It could even happen after the MMP, but Agile is built into this process that you can pivot at any time, and you should be pivoting at any time. I talked before about Agile being a philosophy. There are certain methods of Agile that you will see in the world that have specific processes. Kanban, Scrum, Safe, Lean, Extreme Programming. We're probably going to just focus on Scrum. Scrum is the most relatable for Agile UX and the Google Design Sprint. I totally encourage you all to look at this stuff and look at the different methods of Agile and see how they differ from each other. The most common in the world are Scrum and Kanban. Extreme Programming and Safe are pretty common too. But Scrum method is basically working on your iterations in the same amount of time every time you do it. The work chunk that we talked about before. So this MVP, or even before that, the dev iteration that comprises the MVP is always the same chunk of time. So in Scrum, your dev iteration that I'm showing here is always 1 week or always 2 weeks or always 3 weeks, depending on what the team decides. It never stops. It's always the same time frame. Before you have the sprint, which is the iteration, we call it the sprint. You do a planning meeting. You have a list of to-dos called the backlog. You plan whatever your next sprint is going to include, which is probably a small amount of functionality. And then you deliver it, and you go back to the drawing board and you plan again. You keep going. And there are 3 different types of roles, typically, in Scrum. Roles do not mean human beings. Roles are basically responsibilities that someone has to play on the team. Usually there's no more than 7 people on a Scrum team on paper, usually. The roles are important to understand before we get into Google Design Sprint. So the product owner, that's a role in Scrum. The product owner is the voice of the customer. They understand the needs and behavior and pain points. They're carrying out the vision that's set forth. They know what the MMP is. They know what their plan for MVP1 is. They're helping the team carry that out. They're also usually the decider of what gets prioritized in the product, what doesn't get prioritized in the product. The Scrum Master is a coach that usually facilitates things and keeps everybody agile. So they're the people that are masters of the Agile philosophy. Sometimes there are specific people with full-time jobs that are Scrum Masters. And sometimes you have a person called the product manager on the team who is the product owner and the Scrum Master. Depends on the team. But the role of Scrum Master is very important to make sure that everybody can fail fast, everybody's staying on the Agile philosophy, and usually it also includes unblocking people from what they're prevented from working on. And a development team is also a vague term on Scrum. In the role perspective, it's anybody doing work in the sprint. So it could be a designer, it could be a QA person, it could be a coded developer, it could be a database analyst or a DevOps person. You all are considered the development team if you're doing work in the sprint. Now, let's talk about Agile UX. Agile UX, again, is a philosophy. It is carrying out UX in the Agile philosophy. It is not a method. It's not a process. It's very related to Agile methods for development. So like Scrum is an Agile method of development. And there are different methods of Agile UX. There's Lean UX. There's continuous learning. There's Guerrilla UX. There's design sprints. They're all related to each other. We're going to focus on design sprints. They are directly related to Scrum and directly related to other things too. But just for the sake of this presentation and like an introductory to Agile UX, this is probably the easiest method to understand out of all of them. So what Agile UX lets you do as a philosophy is it lets you validate things before you develop. It lets you pivot your vision as you learn. It lets you show users and stakeholders your progress early and often, get their feedback, get their buy-in, get their validation, get their understanding of what you need to change. It lets you integrate the process of knowledge sharing on teams. It lets you determine a direction for something in a week. It lets you experiment with new ways of working, new ways of doing research. And just like development, Agile UX also has a cadence. You do your iteration, you release, you do some work for UX, you analyze the results, you put the results and the feedback into the backlog, and then you plan your next sprint. And over time, it's not about value to users. You can think about it in terms of knowledge about users. You're learning about users more and more. You're learning more and more about your user behavior, your user needs every time you go out and do a UX iteration. And you're still operating toward the MVP. You are delivering MVPs of everything. In every single iteration, you deliver your minimum viable product. Your minimum viable product of the UX is still something usable and valuable and testable and actionable and minimal. And then it goes into your dev cycle, whatever work you've done. And out of the dev cycle comes back to you into your UX backlog. And still as a UXer, you'd still, at every step, work toward a minimum viable product. Minimum viable product does not mean it's coded. Product is vague. Product is a concept, but it's still simple. And in the context of UX, is this too much research or design to do in 1 week, in one sprint? If yes, it's not MVP. Is it valuable? Is it the most important thing that you could be working on right now? Is it the most important outcome that you need to achieve for the team? If not, it's not MVP. Is it actionable? Will it give the team enough results to make some type of decision about something? Can they use that decision to make some other type of decision or move forward with something? If no, it's not an MVP. Is it testable? Can you validate the thing that you've designed or created with users? Is it a usable piece of functionality? If no, it's not MVP. So now we're going to look at the method of Agile UX, one single method in particular called the Google Design Sprint. We're going to get nerdy for a second. But to back up, the underlying premise around UX and Agile UX is that we are scientists. We follow the scientific method for everything that we do. Everything that you think you know about your solution is an assumption to test. All we do is follow the scientific method. We construct a hypothesis, form our assumptions. We build an experiment to test it with users. We go out and test it with users. It's either true or false or unsure. We're not sure. And then we go back into the beginning of it and do more research. We do more experiments. That's the UX process in a nutshell. Google Design Sprint is following the scientific method in 5 days. 1 week. That's it. And you still have the roles that we talked about before in Scrum. They're called something a little different, but they're still the same concept. The Sprint Master in Google Design Sprints is your conductor. They're kind of the mix between the product owner and the Scrum Master. They understand how to perform the UX research methods and coach around which methods to pick. They keep everybody agile. They coach on other topics. They keep everybody on task. They're the people that are kind of driving the whole show. The decider is the person that you can point to and say, what do we do, decider? Which way do we go? Yes or no? And that person makes the final call. The doers are people that do the work in the sprint. They're just called the doers. So it could be UX researchers, it could be UX designers, it could be other people that you have working with you alongside the UX work. Anybody doing work in the sprint is called the doer. And the customer experts and the technical and the design experts, the people that will be guests in your sprint. You might invite them for a day to involve themselves in some conversation around some topic of expertise that they have. So for instance, if you are learning about medical billing and you're doing a design sprint for medical billing, you might invite a customer expert that is an expert in medical billing to pick their brain during one single step of that design sprint. You don't always need those people in the sprints. It's a team makes a decision case by case. There could also be technical experts or design experts, people that are going to weigh in on those domains of expertise. The doers are always in the sprint, and the experts are guests. So we're not out of the nerd yet. This is the process of Google Design Sprint. On Monday, you're at the understand step. On Tuesday, you're at the diverge and brainstorm step. On Wednesday, you're at the decide step. On Thursday, you're at the create step. And Friday, you're at the test step. And when you're done, you present the results and you analyze everything and you move on, plan your next sprint. And meanwhile, in the real world, things rarely play out in the way that that process describes. What it might look like in the real world is maybe you're spanning multiple days to do 2 steps. So maybe you're doing understand and brainstorm on Monday. And then you're doing decide and create on Tuesday. And you're still finishing on Wednesday your create step, but then you start testing. And on Thursday, you're still testing. On Friday, you're testing as well, and you do your demo. That wasn't covered in the book. And yet, here it is. It's fitting Agile into the context of a team. When I first learned this on the job, I brought it to the table on a team, and the team was a bunch of business people who were working maybe 3 or 5 hours a week on this thing. It wasn't a team of UX people. It wasn't people working full-time. The book was written in the sense of you have a full team of UX designers and researchers working full-time all week. It doesn't ever talk about what you do if it's not the situation. What ends up happening in the world is you bend the rules, break the rules to fit the mold of your team. And every single time you go out and do a sprint, before you start the sprint, you want to plan your sprint. Pick your items that you want to put in to the work, into the iteration. It's usually a team consensus. Team gets together, says, we want to work on this thing. We think it's the most important. And then they do it. Every day, you typically have a meeting called the stand-up, which is your daily touch base. It could happen live. It could happen asynchronously in email or whatever. But you talk about what you did yesterday, each person, what each person's going to do today, and what blockers they have. And then that way the team can discuss, how do we prevent you from being blocked? How do we move you forward so that you can keep doing your work? At the understand step, which may happen on Monday, may not, you discuss what your research topics are. You talk about the implications and the outcomes. You identify why it's important, and you get your background. And that's it. That's the understand step. When you diverge and brainstorm, you get into the problem pretty deeply. You're brainstorming, you're sketching ideas, you're talking about why it's a problem and what's a problem for it and who, what, when, or why. You're digging into it. You don't discuss how you're going to, what you're going to choose, or how you're going to test your ideas. But you do that next. And when I say step for test, it could be any UX research method. The book that you'll read will talk about prototype testing. And I'm here to tell you that you can follow any UX research method in 5 days, period. So when you're doing these types of things, you can pick any method under the sun to test your ideas. There are 2 steps involved in that. You have to decide what you're going to test and how you're going to test it, and then you need to create the test. Creating the test might mean you're creating the research questions, you're creating the test script, you're creating the prototype. And in between then, you have to recruit. In the old days before COVID, we would just go out on the street and you just go talk to people. And sometimes you can do that online, sometimes you can't, but sometimes recruiting happens ahead of time. But the next step after that is to test and run your tests. It's however many people you can fit in 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, depending on what you're actually doing in the world. And then when you come back after you're done your test, you demo what you learned. You don't analyze it. You just present, what did you seek out to do? What were the outcomes? How'd you test it? What happened in the test? What are the results? And then separately from that, you analyze. That might happen after the sprint. It might happen during the next sprint. You don't do that during the demo typically. But at some point, we're also taking a retrospective to look back on the sprint and say, what did we do that we can improve as a team? What did we do well as a team? Every single method of implementation of Scrum also has this step. And this is where people fail fast and build fast. After they build fast, they're failing fast and they learn how to adjust fast in the retro. And this is one way of how a retro could play out. It might be that your team is talking about what they liked, what they learned, what they lacked, and what they longed for. It could be other things. And when you do your next planning, you're going to go back to the drawing board like we talked about before, reprioritize the work ahead, and plan your next sprint. And then the cycle continues. And things are going to go wrong. They always do. And that's when you need to be prepared to pivot in the middle of the sprint. Somebody might have the power to decide if work gets cut or work stops or new work is added. And that would be the decider's role. You got to be ready to fail fast. You got to be ready to pivot. All right, so step 0, there's a great book, the official book called Sprint. That's the book about design sprints. I would totally read that book first. It won't give you the context of how to operate it in the world, anything deviating from what they talk about in the book, but it will give you a great background. And then what you need to do is you need to put your scientist hat on and write down all your research questions, put them in priority order, and pick the most important ones to start with first. Then you have to plan your sprint and figure out who's going to be involved and who's going to do the work and who's going to be the doer, who's going to be the sprint master, who's going to be the decider. And then you just do it. Sprint. Fail fast. And then you come back, figure out what you learned, present your results, and you analyze it, you build your backlog again, and you repeat the process. In closing, just do it. Don't talk about it forever, just do it. I've got a template. If you look at the slides, you look at this last slide right here. You click on this, there's a document that you can get that is a template for this, for the Google Design Sprint. Now with that, I'm going to take questions for anybody who wants to ask. Nobody's got questions?
Through the chat or orally?
Yeah, you could just come off mute and ask.
Okay. Hi, my name is Constance. I am just wondering, as far as like user confidence, and if you have a client, not so much user confidence, but like your client's confidence. And if you're like a startup, or your product or your service is new and isn't, you don't really have much to back up on in order to like continually be failing and testing. So it's like you have to have that confidence in your product in order to do this process. That's where I don't know how that works. I don't know if I was clear about the question.
Tell me more about like the confidence stuff. Like what would you be performing in theory that you would need the confidence for?
I can imagine that, like, you know, products that you trust in can fail, right? Because you know their history, you know that they provide great service or they have a great product. But if you're starting out and you don't have that many users or you don't have so many customers, failing, I feel like, or showing a client that you're failing at what you're trying to put out on the market might lose confidence with your stakeholders. I don't know if
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally see what you mean.
How do you handle that if you're like a startup or a small company, right?
Yeah, I think it usually takes the form of discovery and exploratory research in the beginning to build the confidence before you are getting into the point of validating some type of solution. Just like you would on a team where somebody has to define the vision for that product. In order to define the vision for the product, you're either taking a blind stab at something or you have some founded research to go off of. And the Google Design Sprint and Agile UX supports both. You could literally take a blind stab at a vision, go out and do a week's worth of sprint work, and come back with the results and keep moving from there. Well, we learned this about this, so we're going to adjust this and keep testing. Or your first 10 sprints would be just research, no prototyping, exploratory research, surveys, interviews, observations, card sorts, whatever have you. And each of that piece of work builds on top of each other too. Does that make sense, Constance?
Oh yeah, totally. So, you know, investing a little bit more time in the research, given your status as a company or as a new product on the market, right? That totally makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, your product manager is already doing that research. They can just do it in a sprint. They're already doing that stuff. They're doing product market fit. They're doing competitive analysis. They're doing a product vision for things. And you can time box that stuff and put it into a sprint.
Right. Make it agile in itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that helps. Anybody who has a question, you all can just come off mute.
Yeah, hi Morgan. Yeah, this is Geetu.
Hey.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Yeah. So I have this pretty basic question actually. Like, what exactly? I don't know if you've already covered it in your session. I joined in a little bit late. What actually differentiates Kanban from Scrum?
Oh, that's a good question. I didn't go over that.
Okay.
So Kanban is not time boxed. If you're doing Scrum, you're doing every piece of work falls into a 2-week cycle.
Okay.
So if I have a ticket and I finish that ticket in 2 days, I don't release that ticket until 2 weeks. Right? Because it has to release with the sprint end. If I'm doing Kanban, I finish the ticket in 2 days and I release the ticket in 2 days and then I pick up the next ticket. And it's basically just a continuous feed of work in Kanban.
Okay.
Does that make sense, you two?
Yeah, sure. So how is what is the advantage of Scrum over Kanban actually? Kanban sounds more beneficial actually. I mean, when you explain it like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's more agile. It's also a lot more chaotic. You can't really plan easily.
Oh, okay.
Not that you can't plan at all with Kanban, you can, but it gets way more complicated to plan and forecast. Because often the business wants to hear from you, when can you deliver this feature? Can you deliver it in this date? You have 2.5 months. And being able to forecast that in Kanban takes a whole lot of measurement work.
Oh,
But in Scrum,
okay.
it's relatively easy because you already know how many sprints ahead you are. Those
Okay.
are always the same amount of time.
Oh, okay. So at TechPeak, you're basically following Scrum rather than Kanban,
Yeah, if
like
you're,
for our project.
yep, yeah, definitely. We're following Scrum for our
Okay,
technical
okay.
stuff. Yep,
Okay, that clears a lot. Thank you, thank you.
yeah. Anybody else have questions?
My name is Liz, and I had a quick question. I'm just looking at your sprint planning slide, and I was curious, for the items in the backlog, do they always move forward? Meaning, let's say you're in progress on something and you have to quickly pivot.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever move backwards, or do you create like a discard pile of some sort?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would put you could do it in several ways. There's no like right or wrong way. There's only the way that the person who's managing the backlog decides is better or worse for them. So sometimes you have a blocked column. If you can't move ahead and you have to stop all the work, you put it in the blocked column. I as a product owner would never put a ticket that already has been worked on back in the backlog unless I didn't do the work for the sake of cleanliness. I would document what happened to the ticket, what did I not get finished, put it into the in progress or done, and then create a new ticket with the new scope. That's just me. I've totally seen other people before put old tickets into the backlog. That drives me crazy as a product owner.
Right.
But that's just me.
Okay, good point. Thanks.
Yep. Why do you ask? Is there a reason that you're curious?
I have been on a project where we've had a discard pile or a discard column. So I was just curious as to other people's practices.
Yeah, I've had like a blocked column before, which is basically
Okay.
what I can envision as the discard pile. The discard, I guess, would be permanent.
That's right.
Like, yeah, like a graveyard or something. But blocked is usually temporary. So if I put something in blocked on Tuesday, it might get unblocked on Wednesday and put it back in progress. So I might have both in the backlog.
Got it. Okay.
I've had a backlog of the backlog before. So you have like an active backlog, and then you have like a really old ticket backlog that never really gets looked at more than once every 3 months or something.
Okay.
I think it's all a team decision and how they want to organize that stuff, because I've totally seen it in different ways.
Good to know. Thank you.
Anybody else have questions? All right. I'm going to share out the slides, and I'll share out the recording too. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Hope it's been fun. Hope you learned a lot. And everybody have a great week. Thanks for attending.